This is a little more esoteric than most of our other sessions, and esoteric may not be everyone's cup of tea, so I'm glad that we're able to get together and discuss. As you may recall, last week we introduced the tree of knowledge, which is a cryptic formula for a cosmic flow of that kind of energy which creates the possibility of choice. Toda. The tree of knowledge, good and bad, is of the same stuff, cosmic stuff, that free choice in a human being is. The comparison of our free will, which is a personality dynamic, or whether it is something in terms of intellectual activity, how is that comparable to a tree? And we're not talking about, in this case, a metaphoric tree. We're saying that the stuff of that tree, whatever spiritual energy made up ultimately the manifestation of materiality, is of the same order as our choice mechanism within. The fact that we are made up of tendencies towards good and bad, or the way we described it last week in parallel terms, to ego or other, self-preservation or contribution. That's a very difficult notion, because we compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, but to compare human personality trait to a tree is a very difficult notion. So just accept for the time being that that's really what the substance of that Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, good and bad, was all about, so that when Adam and Chava imbibed from it, they therefore unfortunately, became lesser as a consequence by having to go through life exercising the choice. They were no longer naive, there was no longer a sense of innocence. Then it was the hard work of being able to separate the good and bad. Previously was separated. Okay, having said that, we're going to go on this week and look at something prior to the Eitz Hadas as such, how it came into being. And it came into being in context of the process of creation. We are talking about almost first day and pre-first day. And what we're talking about is what was before the first day. And the human being can't begin to contemplate that, begin to imagine that, because for the human being, we only are conscious within the realm of time and space, as we discussed. We can't contemplate, consider, have any imaginative capacity of something that is spaceless and timeless. Even the very use of our words, space and time, is something which are concretized. What does it mean to be spaceless, let alone timeless? Can anyone begin to imagine what that could be? I don't think we can. And even our most spiritual capacity, imagination, which allows us to manipulate the physicality of life and border on the spirituality, fails at that point. And we no longer can grapple with it. So the Kabbalists, in discussing what that transition from nothingness to somethingness utilized, was the metaphor, sometimes the allegory, sometimes the simile, with the caution that every such description is merely an pedagogical tool to help us understand. So when I'm now going to give you some pictorial representation of a process now, please note, this pedagogical tool I'm using is meant to help us to get the merest glimpse of what the dynamic consisted of. Firstly, The dominant characteristic of creation is chesed, contribution, sharing. God didn't have to create a world. What for? Can't really ask that question, because to answer that question ultimately is to enter into the mind of God, which we can't. However, God wanted to create a world. In order to do that, that's an act of contribution. That means bringing into being something that wasn't previously. That characteristic of contribution then runs through all aspects of creation, in all of its manifestations. The human being who is created in the image of God, imitatio Dei in the Latin, therefore the human being's dominant characteristic is one of sharing. And that's why if we ever want to identify moments of supreme happiness, moments of great sense of personal fulfillment, you'll find that they always are around acts of contribution and sharing. Just cast your mind back to the last occasion when perhaps you felt elated to some extent. And I have no doubt it was part and parcel of sharing a moment with somebody else who was very close. Or sharing a moment of closeness with the world. Or sharing a moment of closeness with an experience, which means that you were able to reach out and encompass something, whatever it might be. And that's the state of da'at, knowing. Okay? So, since Hashem possessed this characteristic, Hashem contributed to the world purely from the ultimate act of chesed, which we then, therefore, exemplify. The process is an interesting process that Kabbalists describe to us. Since Hashem is infinite, by definition, from our vantage point, Hashem occupies all space and all time as far as our perception of reality is. In order for something to exist with free choice, in order for a world to exist even, what does Hashem have to do? Hashem has to contract itself. Almost, if you will, act against its inner nature, although we can't attribute any characteristics to God. So I'm already using metaphoric terms when I use things like chesed and gevura, expansion and contraction. Remember that. So Hashem had to contract itself to create the possibility of something else to exist. That contraction, as we spoke last week, was the process called tzimtzum, which we mentioned. The result was a void, a nothingness. So there was a great somethingness, whatever that meant, and that was God. Then there was a great nothingness when Hashem contracted itself. And then into that void, that nothingness, which is called a halal, which in Hebrew means void, empty, whole, Hashem irradiated a very minute quality of itself to be able to inflame that nothingness with the minutest characteristic of Hashem. That was a lineal flow of energy called a kav. Kav literally in Hebrew means a line. It was that thin, there was simply a line. This is the line that maintains our finite world in existence. This tiny irradiation. When that tiny irradiation entered into the halal, there was a slight lightening, I should say lighting really, in terms of light, of that emptiness. And out of that, we have a process which related to what we are, but not quite. Most initially, the light, for want of a better term, energy, for want of a better term, had to be contained. Because in something that's going to be finite, even tables and chairs and people and things, there has to be energy contained in a vessel. I mean, who would your soul be if not in a body? It still exists. Of course, there is unembodied souls. What happens to us after we die? The soul remains unembodied before it is reincarnated back again through Gilgul HaNefesh, the cycle of the soul. So there are unembodied nature. Angelic bodies also are formless from our vantage point, although in spiritual terms there is some spiritual form, etc. Therefore, it has to fill and be contained in order to manifest. So, Hashem created a system of vessels, containers, and this light energy was contained within these vessels. However, these vessels were inadequate. Now, how can God create inadequate vessels? How can perfection create imperfection? Logically not possible, so it's part of the intention. Now, in the way that we're describing the nature of creation, these vessels then burst, cracked, and sparks or shards of that original energy spread through the cosmos, through creation, whatever word you want to use. And it is these shards that make up the material world. And the human being's intent in having been created is that we are the spark hunters. Mm-hmm. We collect the sparks, we hunt for these sparks and elevate them to their original source. I have just given you an overview of what we're considering in this particular session. Now, I caution again, everything that I've said is a pedagogical tool to help us understand some process from a point of view of finity. Ultimately, from Hashem's vantage point, none of this exists. If you will, and this is a difficult notion, from God's vantage point, nothing exists. Even after creation. It's a bit like, where is the flame? You take a candle, you light the wick, and there's a beautiful flame. Where would that flame be if it were in the orb of the sun? Would it exist or would it not exist? Say it wasn't extinguished by the dynamics of the solar activity. Say we had this magical situation where this flame was there. Would it have an independence? It would have no independence. Even though it's there, it will have no independence. Even if you had a bonfire here and put that flame there in the bonfire, it still would have no sense of independence. How much more so in the orb of the sun? And that is the nature of creation in relationship to the creative energy that maintains it. So you could say that from Hashem's vantage point, there is nothing. The flame doesn't exist. That's just a nice way of portraying our relationship. But the curiosity is that Hashem screens out this immense energy which maintains everything in existence, screens out through a mechanism we're not going to necessarily discuss in this series, whatever Tzimtzum is, to allow us to be able to go through life exercising choice. And exercising choice, Bechira Chavshis, which resulted from eating from the tree of knowledge, good and bad, is the whole raison d'etre of creation. That is the story. Did you like my little story? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Why do you refer to Hashem as it when Hashem Hu Elokim Avinu Elokim? Yeah, because in this I refer to Hashem always as it when I can, because I know that in today's world, people, men and women, are much more sensitive to the use of gender. Okay, and I understand that. In every time you have to use the right language so that we don't have an artificial barrier between people. And Rashi also explains that the use of the masculine is only a convenient term because Hashem is both masculine and feminine. Shekhinah is the feminine side of the Godhead, so there's masculinity and femininity there. So rather than keep oscillating between he and she, and you counting how many times did he say he and how many times did he say she, I use it for convenience. Okay? All right. So let's have a look at the source material. And then we'll get some of the terminology of this. Yes?
Chesed and Gevura is like the Tzimtzum is like this.
Tzimtzum is a process of Gevura. Tzimtzum is contraction. Hashem contracted itself. You contract yourself. For example, you hold back. What's for example, tough love? Sometimes parents have to exercise tough love. Sometimes you have to exercise tough love, whether it's in a business setting or a friendship setting. What's tough love? Means that underlying it is chesed, but in that moment you have to practice gevurah, holding back, because that is wise balance for the moment. The assertive no to a child, the child says, give me, give me, give me, and you don't give all the time. Sometimes you have to say no, and that's part of a very important learning process. And therefore, that's a gevurah within the chesed. Chesed, this, out, I embrace you. Gevurah, I hold back. And the wisdom of that balance is determined by the mind. The mind provides the compass bearing for the emotions to be intelligent. Intelligence, emotional intelligence. Okay, we've used that term before. It's popular out there. All right? Let's have a look at the source material for today. Firstly, we're going to use the words Tohu and Tikkun. Before I use these words definitively, the word Tikkun is used quite glibly and freely out there. I don't know if you've ever heard the term Tikkun, but I'm sure you have. And it's just generically become a word that describes good deeds. The literal meaning of the word Tikkun means repair. Like if something breaks, you repair it. The Hebrew word litaken, to fix up, to repair. So tikkun in our cosmic sense, repairing the damage that Adam and Chava caused by eating from the pre-Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge, good and bad. So that is the real tikkun. Okay, repairing that damage. So although it's extended, and if you Google tikkun, you'll find tikkun societies and generic tikkun. Collecting rubbish off the street is tikkun. Being green in your orientation is tikkun. But that's not the tikkun that really is authentic within. Okay, so we're using the word in its original sense, and we'll see what real tikkun really means. Firstly, everything that we're talking about, Hassidut and Kabbalah, must be based on the Torah. If it's not based in the Torah, it cannot have any authenticity. So, right, you have to always ask, if you find your local Kabbalist wandering the streets and you want to check him out or her out, you must first check how authentic they are, or he or she is, and that is a question of authenticity of the Torah as such. Therefore, the source material must go back to the Torah itself. What is the Torah? The Torah is the blueprint of creation. I'm describing these ideas of methodology of creation. But if you want to see the architectural drawings, you open up the Torah. As we may have said before, the shape of the letters, right? The juxtaposition of the letters, the arithmetical correlation of the letters and the words, the musical, what we call trop, notes, which allows the reader, the reader who knows on Shabbos, to read the Torah correctly. Every element of this, the small letters and the large letters, are part of a spiritual architectural diagram, providing us insights into the methodology of creation. It's absolutely fascinating. By the way, if you look in a Sefer Torah for these musical notes or for the undervowels, you will not find them for various reasons. And yet the reader on Shabbos or Mondays and Thursdays, when we read the Torah or Yom Tov, has been trained to memorize every single note on every single word in the whole Torah. So when you are sitting and listening to the Torah on Shabbos, have a little bit of mercy on the person out there doing the reading. You know, this when everyone's talking away and catching up on the social gossip and things like that. That guy out there who is reading the Torah has been training for years to be able to read the notes correctly without them being in the Torah itself. So it's an amazing feat. And yet it happens all the time. And youngsters, for their bar mitzvah, sometimes learn the whole Sedra in that particular format. It stretches the mind, it stretches the heart, and stretches the soul. Good training. So that's what the Chumash is, an architectural, spiritual design drawing. Okay, so let's look at 3 sources within the Torah for tonight's session. And the first source is right in the beginning of Bereshis, right in the beginning of the book of Genesis. It's the second verse, a verse that you're very, very familiar with. And the verse in translation says, and the earth was tohu vavohu. And Rashi explains, the commentator par excellence, that the word tohu, which is a difficult word to define, it doesn't occur elsewhere, means astonishingly formless, which is a strange juxtaposition, because on one word refers to the state of the thing, formless, or the no thing, and the other one is, how would a human being respond if we were to have been there? And the answer is, we would be so utterly astonished. If you can find a stronger word than astonished, then please use it. I couldn't think of one. And formless. It would be totally inexplicable. It would defy our senses. We would have no way of even grasping what it is that we're experiencing in that state of tohu, that the world was at, or the cosmos was at the beginning, at the dawn of time. The second word, vohu, means it had no form, it had no meaning. We wouldn't be able to decipher anything from it whatsoever. Certainly no corporeality, no meaning. So these are the 2 words that are used at the beginning of the Chumash to describe the state of being, which is already advanced. That state of astonishment, of formlessness, and being devoid of corporeality or anything like that is already an advanced stage. I spoke at the beginning of our class of the stages before. The creation of the halal, the creation of the vacuum. Then I spoke about the kav, the minute energy that now irradiates the whole world, and from which was creation took place. And at that point, somewhere soon after, we have the state of tohu vavohu. But from a human vantage point, impossibility to even begin to understand the experience. That's the first verse. The second verse comes much further on in, again, the book of Genesis, in Bereshis. And it deals with a seemingly minor historical piece of information that deals with the political machinations and developments of the land of Edom and the lands around it there. And it says, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom, before any kings who reigned over children of Israel. We didn't have kings in those days. We're talking a period in history prior Shaul, before the first king Saul. Okay?
Is this before or after the split between Jacob and Esau?
This is the time. This is exactly the time.
Where the successes of...
Yes, we're talking about this just at that moment. Very good. At that moment in history, when these things were occurring, this actually occurred immediately subsequent to that. Yeah, okay. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any kings who reigned over the children of Israel. And then it goes on and says, King Bela died, and then King Yovav died, and King Husham died. It says, this guy lived, and he died, and the next guy takes over. This happens 8 times sequentially in those few verses, in those 8 verses. 8 kings are mentioned who lived and died one after the other. It's going to be terribly significant Kabbalistically. Because what we're going to say is, further down the track, that this becomes the information for the whole process of Tohu, the explosion of the vessels that couldn't contain the original light. And it's hinted at, it's more than a hint. It's really a subterranean, it's embedded, that this is the verse that actually portrays that. Remember, there are 4 levels of deciphering what this architectural drawing is all about. The first level is to open our eyes and see the squiggles and the lines. You know, if you open up an architectural drawing and you see what the architect is doing, what do? You see lines, you see notations, etc., etc. Fine, shut. I'm seeing with my eyes squiggles. Fine. Then there's a deeper level in Torah called remez. Remez means, what does it hint at? What are these squiggles and lines hinting at? They're hinting at certain aspects of drawing. You look at the drawing and say, oh, okay, I get a sense that this is a house and it's not a fire engine.
So it's about what's to come.
Okay. Remez is a hint of not what's to come even, but what's underlying it, the deeper meaning of the overt text. Then there's a third level of understanding this architectural drawing called the Torah. And that third level is called drush. Drush, which the Hebrew word midrash, which refers to a whole set of literature, it talks about, is a very interesting, much deeper level. If you look up the book of Midrash, you know what you'll find? Quaint stories, anecdotes. And you'll ask yourself, what is the deep wisdom somehow embedded in here? I can't see it. These are nice little stories, tales. Rest assured that beneath these tales are much more profound understanding of what the tale is really trying to convey. So what's the purpose of telling a moral tale? Who are the moral tellers in the secular literature? Come on.
Aesop.
Aesop's tales. Okay? They're moralistic. We use them for children. Why? Because each fable provides some sort of moral lesson. Okay? So what's the process of a tale or an allegory or even a metaphor? It's to hide the information. When I tell you the tale, I'm not talking about the deep philosophical moral virtue that the tale wants to embellish and provide. I'm not telling you a story. But if we study the story, beneath it we learn the morality story beneath it, then we understand that the story tells us something. Midrash, drush, hides the ostensible information in order to allow us to see it. Isn't that irony? Hiding in order to allow us to see it? Which is really what we're talking about at drush level. And then, if you thought that was deep, then we have the final level called sod. It's actually not the final level. The level called sod, which literally means secret, is how there is within this architectural drawing some further dimension of depth that borders on mysticism. It's not just an architectural drawing in 3 dimensions. There's a 4th dimension in this architectural drawing. A 4th dimension that has got to do with higher spiritual understanding. And Kabbalah is associated with that level. Okay? I said that's not the final level, because historically what happened later on in the 17th century is Hasidism came into being and was and was able to breathe life of common understanding into each of those 4 levels. And that's a 5th level, but not a level of depth, but a level of enlightenment of the 4 levels.
What is it? What do you call it?
Hasidism. Okay. So when we read this statement, these are the kings who reigned, remember we can understand at all these different levels. At the 4th level and 5th level, if you will, Kabbalah and Hassidus, this refers to the understanding of what took place in the process of creation when the vessels burst and the sparks then were able to spread throughout the cosmos to create what we call reality of time and space. So that's the second source material here. And the third one, which chronologically occurs actually just before the second one, and the messengers returned to Jacob, to Yaakov, saying that there had been no change in Eisav and that he is confronting you with an army of 400 mercenaries. What was the background to that? You remember that there was an estrangement between the 2 brothers, Yaakov and Eisav. And then there's this attempted rapprochement between the 2. But Yaakov, who initiates this, is full of trepidation, because he remembers Esav's antipathy for having... Why was Yaakov scared of Eisav?
Because Eisav wanted to kill him.
So why did Eisav want to kill him?
The birthright.
The birthright. He seemingly claimed that the birthright had been stolen. In a moment of weakness, Eisav gave it over to his brother, but Really, he says that's not fair. And now Yaakov, after all these years, seeks the reconciliation, but he doesn't know Esav's state of mind. That's the story. The deeper story, the text underneath. Eisav represents, for reasons we may not be able to get deeply into, the world of Tohu, the world where the vessels are unable to contain the sparks. Chaos.
It's actually
Yaakov,
said explicitly when he's expelled though, which has relevance today.
yes,
That he is a wild ass man.
yes,
And everywhere he goes, he will dominate and cause fights over
correct.
Islam today. You know
But I'm going to give you some redeeming virtues of Eisav, and I'm going to say to you that ultimately Eisav is going to be rebuilt into the highest level. Wait there.
Must be Rome.
Beyond that. Okay.
What's the joke?
Edom is Rome. Yeah,
Rome.
Edom is Rome. Okay, but it goes further, it becomes Western culture and Europe, etc. Okay, so we have this situation of Eisav representing chaos, representing the state of Tohu, where the sparks can't be contained, and we have Yaakov representing Tikkun. Now, we haven't yet discussed what Tikkun is, but we've said it's the state of repair. Yaakov is the one who has to effect repair in Eisav in some shape or form. And this rapprochement is to be the determining meeting to be able to create that. If that took place, then Mashiach would come and we'd be moving to the next stage. So here we have Yaakov sends messengers ahead checking out, come on, let me see what Eisav is up to these days. Has he refined himself? Has he worked on himself? Has he been moved from the position of chaos, and has Tikkun taken place within the chaos to repair the damage caused? And instead the messengers come back and say to him, he's coming at you with 400 mercenaries. His aggressive nature is all there. He is still in a state of tohu. There hasn't been any state of repair. Who are these messengers? So Rashi says the word malachim, which in Hebrew means messengers, also is the word to describe angels. And Rashi says the angels, Yaakov was on a first name basis with the angelic world because he's pretty high up in the scheme of things. So he sends some angels ahead because they're sort of much clearer about their mission. They don't have to exercise choice. Angels don't have choice. The difference between a human being and an angel is that a human being has bechira chafshis, bechira, choice, chafshit, free choice. Angels don't. Angels are created for only specific missions, and they can't depart, not because they have no choice, in the sense of, oh, I have a choice but I'm forced. They don't know choice. They're just mission-oriented. That's why you have Michael. Michael is the angel of Chesed. Got no choice. He's the part of us that is giving. Gabriel, Gevura, is the angel of withdrawal. Odiel, in front of us, is the angel of enlightenment from Or. Or Raphael is the angel behind us to heal. Refuah, healing. But they have no other. Michael can't become one or the other. So he sends these angelic forces out to check out what's happening with Eisav, because we're looking at a spiritual inquiry. Where is Eisav in terms of spiritual repair? And ordinary messengers couldn't tell that.
Eisav chose to be told and all that. So that was a conscious choice that he made.
Well, yes and no. Yeah, of course it is. That's because he's a human being at this point. But nevertheless, there are spiritual forces at work, even at a distance, that were attempts to create that state. And that's why it says later on in the Chumash that one day Yaakov will revisit Eisav on his home territory. It says Yaakov will go up to Har Eisav, to the mountain of Eisav, And at that point, the true reconciliation will take place, which means Tikkun will have effected change in Tohu, and the two, as we'll see shortly, will have created a much higher world than either Tohu or Tikkun. Interesting notions. You may go back and write little stories about these things. All right, so that's the source material that we're looking at. Now let's discuss it a little bit. So, as we said, the original state of being is that the world of chaos, the world of Tohu, implodes. The 8 kings die. That's what the reference is from those psukim, which means the original vessels could not contain the original light, the original energy. And the result is the world of Tikkun. Now, the world of Tikkun means that we have the capacity to repair. So it's ironically that seemingly the lower level, the result of imperfection, has the capacity to be able to repair something that's higher. So, Sefer HaYetzirah, which is the first book of Kabbalah written by Abraham, has a wonderful little passage that says, and I've quoted to you last week, the end is wedged in the beginning and the beginning is wedged in the end. In other words, whatever is ultimately foremost in my intent is manifested ultimately at the lowest level. The beginning is wedged in the end. I have a picture of a design of a beautiful house I want. Only ultimately when this imaginative, spiritual phenomenon of my imagination becomes manifested in brick and mortar and decoration and decor and all these things, that's when's the end result. So it's funny that it begins with a highly spiritualized state and ends up in a highly materialist state. In other words, the beginning is wedged in the end. But the end is wedged in the beginning. That end, that finite, beautiful house, which is finally built and I can step into it, is what originated originally in my beginning thought process. The beginning is wedged in the end, and the end is wedged in the beginning. That's the first point. The second point is a Hasidic adage that says, the stone at the top of the wall falls furthest from the wall. We understand it in principles of physics. Something that's higher up has got higher potential energy, and the resultant kinetic energy as it moves allows it to roll further away from the wall. So if something high up falls, it tends to fall with greater force and can move further away from the wall. But it also goes to the lowest place. Very good. Okay, so Robert is saying that when this part comes down, it's further away from the plane that it originally was. It was the top, but it comes further away from the plane of its origin, which means that which is highest becomes the lowest, can fall further. That's why the human being, just in passing, in parenthesis, the human being can fall further as a conscious being than an animal or a plant or an inanimate object. We are capable of the beastliest activities, much more so than animals, certainly more than plants, much more so than inanimate objects, because the stone at the top of the wall falls furthest from the wall. So, in that sense, Tikkun, which means the state of repair, which the human being is the lever of creation and can effect, and although we're seemingly much lower, Yaakov was able to effect the Tikkun in Eisav, and you and I have the capacity to elevate the state of the world. How do we do that? By living consciously, by living mindfully, and by carrying out the process called Nitzutzot, which we're going to come to towards the end of this class, because that's the methodology of being able to elevate the original sparks that fell into all things of existence and bringing them back to a higher state. Return. So we are the repairman of the world. Okay? So, now, in the original state of chaos, in the original state of Tohu, the reason that it exploded is because there was no capacity for these sparks to intermingle. There was friction between them, and the resultant friction and energy exploded the whole system. It's like human beings. That's what war is. within our own situation. That's what breakdown of marriages. In other words, the friction reaches a point where it can no longer coexist. We find it in the physics lab, we find it in human behavior, we find it in the animal kingdom, and that's what happens as a consequence of the nature of Tohu. That's the Tohu element within us. That's a Tohu element within the world. And that friction caused that explosion at the supernova spiritual level. The result of that is that everything's jumbled all around the world, and there is positive and negative. Hence the tree of knowledge, good and bad, became its manifestation. And later on, Adam and Chava were able to absorb, unfortunately, from that and become that. And hence our dilemma as human beings. I mean, it's a bit like when you have a great idea in your mind. It's so great that you can't express it. And you attempt to express it, and you stammer, and you stutter. The stammering and the stuttering is the distance between the physicalization of the idea into sound, word, which will convey it to you, me conveying it to you, and what it is intact in my mind. I can't get it out to you, so I try this way and that way, and then I end up stuttering and I can't get it out. It's just too big. That's what happened within the vessels of Tohu. It was just too big, and it was friction, and it couldn't get out. Therefore, we had spiritual nuclear fission. All right?
So can you say that Yetzirah is basically creativity as well? It comes from...
We're even at a stage where those four worlds haven't yet come into existence when we talk about a Tohu. Only in the process of Tikkun do we have then a spiritual universe created with orderly levels. In Tohu, there's no orderly levels. There's no order. There's no shape. Total formlessness. Tohu. Nothingness. Or meaninglessness. Yes.
Translated as black hole.
The spiritual black hole, the ultimate spiritual black hole. Except the interesting thing is that in the physics parallel of black hole, it draws things into it, whereas these things spread out everywhere. Okay, that's where the analogy might break down. Now, these sparks, which are everywhere, I'm using the word sparks obviously just as a way of, again, conveying a notion. These sparks are so powerful that they can't possibly be contained. It's only the glimmer of these sparks that are contained within everything. So the way that these sparks operate are without and within. So within, they become memale, which we spoke about last week, the way that the spiritual energies make up the nature of existence, maintain the form and shape of the table, be you, me, everything that exists in the whole universe. But there is the element of spark, the light, which can't be contained because it's just infinite. And that's the aura of existence. That's the spiritual context of existence. That's why you and I have this drive beyond what's logical. That's why people can sometimes act amazingly beyond their apparent barriers. That's why a woman or a man who, God forbid, sees their child pinned under a car can lift the car up in that impulse of moment. No way known how they generated that strength. These things, of course, have happened. I'm not talking about something that is fiction. Or how a soldier, under conditions of fire, can be shot several times and continue unaware that he has been shot. Again, phenomena. In other words, we somehow contract these infinite koichos, which come from that unfillable aspect of these sparks. The things that fill us are normalcy, the way I'm strong normally. But then there is the potential, as a consequence of being surrounded by this sovev, surrounding infinite potential, the spark, to absorb that and to be able to tap into it and utilize it. And these are the breakthroughs of life. They're the breakthroughs physically, they're the breakthroughs intellectually, they're the breakthroughs spiritually, where we go beyond ourselves. And in Gematria, it's represented by the number 8 as opposed to the number 7. The number 7 is the number of nature, 7 days of creation. Everything operates within 7. 8 is the step beyond nature. Okay? That's why Hanukkah has 8 lights. A miraculous event, something beyond. Each one of us has the 8th potential within us. Our normal behavior is 7. So, we are the result of the shattering of the vessels, and these vessels, as they are in their shattered state, are sufficient to maintain the raw state of being that we live in. What's our task? Tikkun. You and I have to go around to be able to lift up these sparks and to be able to restore them. And the way we do that is to help each other, to help the world, but there are specific ways of doing that. You know, how do you know that you're really helping? Maybe you're hurting. You know, sometimes you enter into a situation to give a person advice and you mean really well, but the result is damage. Is there any manual that provides the possibility of getting it right? So yeah, if you study the professions, you're more likely to get the commercial laws right, the psychological laws right, the physics laws right, okay? In the endeavor of spirituality, we have to go back to the archetypal document, the Torah, that provides us the formula on how to get it right. And the way to get it right is 613 mitzvot. The word mitzvah, although commonly translated as commandment, which at some level is correct, really comes from the Aramaic root tzavta, which means connection. Mitzvah is the way we can connect to the imperfection of the world and elevate it. I've used often the example of conscious eating, not exploiting the food we eat, but elevating the sparks within. So when I've used this idea that through a bracha, that sound energy that connects to the particular sparks within, the sparks of Tohu. Today we understand it a little more profoundly than when I said it previously without this particular setting, context. So when you use voice and you use kavanah, focused intention, to elevate the sparks, now we understand what we're doing is we're taking from a state of Tohu and returning it to a higher plane through our process of tikkun. We're elevated. That's just one example. And therefore we honor the food. We don't exploit the food. We don't eat for egotistical reasons or reasons of simply self-preservation. Because it's a good thing, it preserves us. That's why food maintains us. Because food is higher than us. Why is food higher than us? Because the sparks of Tohu are within there in a more profound state. Remember, the lower it falls, the higher the potential. Food is lower than the human being. Therefore, food possesses a greater potential than the human being. And that's why food sustains us and not we sustain the food. Okay? But in order to sustain us in a way where there's a mutuality, we have to honor the food. And to honor the food, the methodology of the Torah is through the mitzvah of how to eat consciously, etc. That's one example. Interpersonal behavior, another obvious example. How to love each other appropriately. And the act of loving each other appropriately is part of the process of being the spark hunter and being able to elevate the sparks that are all around us in terms of Tohu into a higher plane, and if we do it better, we feel fulfilled. I mean, in psychological terms, we talk about therefore being a better relationship, feeling happier, etc. But these are only the manifestations of the spiritual dynamic that are taking place. Why do we feel better? Because we're ultimately a spiritual being. Is because there are spiritual dynamics underlying the features that become called emotion and the resultant fulfillment and happiness. Okay? So when we talk about these things, we're talking about Eisav representing the state of Tohu, the fall, the explosion that reaches the sparks of everywhereness, and he's actually described in the Chumash as the older, bigger brother, which he is. But why give him that wonderful compliment of, you are the older, bigger brother? I mean, there's no need for Chumash to say that. Surely he's the more evil. We don't want to raise his status. But he is potentially the older, bigger brother. He just has to act like an older and bigger brother and possesses the potential. So the Torah extols the potential virtue that he possesses. Okay, so we've got this situation where everything we do is able to elevate the nature of being. Now, what happens? Eisav meets Yaakov and they have to part. Why? Because, as we said before, Yaakov realizes Eisav hasn't yet been redeemed. And they have to part and distance in order to once again come back again. This is the nature of life. Life is this ebb and flow. Ratzu vashuv is the Hasidic terminology, like a tide. A tide flows out, ebbing forwards, backwards, forwards, etc. And that's relationship. Sometimes we're in a state of proximity and closeness with our loved one, and sometimes we're less loving. Sometimes we are strong in the morning when we wake up, and tired in the evening after the day. And everything, the sun rises, the sun sets, everything in existence has an ebb and flow. And that ebb and flow is exactly what we find in this meeting. Yaakov meets Eisav, Ratzu Vashuv, or Ratzo Vashov, depending on the pronunciation. Okay, Reish Tzadik Vav Aleph, and Shov Shin Vav Veit. Okay, so you have this process. Yaakov meets Eisav. The meeting is very unsuccessful. There is a reconciliation at a superficial level. The brothers actually embrace. It says that Eisav kisses Yaakov, and nevertheless there's a parting. And this becomes the cosmic effect of ebb and flow that happens constantly. The way that the nuclei with the protons are surrounded by the electrons, which are then attracted, but then have to move back to their orbit, etc., to maintain the integrity of the substance that these make up the nature of, and the like. So basically, this is really what I wanted to suggest to you. Now, how does this relate to our class last week, as we said, on the Eitz Hadas Tohu? This is the process that led up to the beginning of the Garden of Eden. Gan Eden was this setting, this creation that took place as a consequence of everything we spoke about today. But Adam was created and Chava was created so that the way that the reconciliation could take place would be in quite a different dynamic. We aren't told what that dynamic would have been. How could the world and the purpose of creation have been consummated after 24 hours? It was intended that this existence should only have lasted 24 hours. What has now taken thousands of years, and that scientists claim millions of years or billions of years, etc. Whatever it is, should have been finished in 24 hours. It wasn't. Only because of that act of eating of Pri Eitz Hadas, which slowed down immeasurably the process of Tikkun, which was now needed to do the repair job which you and I had been assigned with great responsibility to carry out. So now we have looked at the predecessor to the Pri Eitz Hadas, and next week we're going to look at the successive circumstances that took place after the Pri Eitz Hadas. Enough for today. Any questions, apart from the thousands?
In the case of twin boys,
yes.
Double portion, the one that pops out first or second?
First, I would have thought, no? Yeah.
The reason I asked the question is because Rashi brings an analogy that in a test tube, you put a ball in the test tube and another one, the one that went in.
The one that was conceived. No, you said born, not conceived.
No, I said ball in the test tube.
It's a metaphor saying that, like in a test tube, you can only put two pebbles, one on top of the other, but the one you put first comes out last, etc. But it's interesting. What is conception? What is birth in our spiritual teachings? Conception takes place in an instant. It's a very, very, probably the most miraculous way that the human being copies God. That's our only truly creative capacity. We don't create anything else in life. Conception is the only thing that's truly created by a human being. It's the way that we copy God's creation of the world. Okay? And that's a very, very holy and special thing. If you look at the Sefirotic, it tells us what should be our mindset, our emotional set, our whole state of consciousness in the state of sexual union. Because everything has an impingement on the resultant moment of conception, which then determines what is going to be the child all about. It's really, really very, very mystical in that respect. So conception already means that what was previously a soul in a state of surround, your soul exists somewhere, suddenly starts to have a mamala aspect. It starts to flow through. Substance is created. Something is there, even if it's one molecule. I don't know what really what it's made up of. Okay, and then it continues to multiply. At that point, we say, while it's still in the mother's nurturing state, it's something of immense importance. No, it's not yet a human being, but it's something of utmost importance. That's why in Jewish law, you can't abort it unless there are specific superimposed reasons which Jewish law says abortion is permissible. One of those circumstances is when the mother's life is at risk. One of the many circumstances. That's one of the circumstances, for reasons which we may not need to go into now. But by and large, we say it's something of great importance. Only when birth takes place, the umbilical cord is cut, do we say that there's a level of independence that creates what you and I might call a human being, and now a new status is comes into being. And English common law actually borrowed from the Torah thinking, from the halachic thinking on this. So you'll find that there's, in English common law, there's also two stages. Abortion is not murder in the English common law, and I'm not talking about contemporary legislation, whether America or Australia, but what historically English common law was, it was called child destruction within the womb, and on birth, it can be immediately murder, etc. But there's a difference in status taken from that, from our Jewish teachings on that. Lord Coleridge, one of the great English jurists, wrote very eloquently on how the English common law is based on the Talmud. Very, very interesting. Yes?
Label the sparks. Are we allowed to say that they are godly sparks?
Yes, but we say everything is godly. Okay?
And so the godly sparks that are contained everywhere, are there some things that have more?
There's not that they have more. I mean, you could say that, but if I were to put it differently, their manifestation is more powerful. So there are geographical parts of the world which are more spiritual, and geographical parts of the world that are less spiritual in human terms. Or the Temple Mount, the Har HaBayit, where the Beit HaMikdash stood, has paramount spiritual power in the world as such. Earth as a planet possesses higher spiritual potential than any of the other planets. Certain human beings, the spiritual soul beats more prominently, whereas it's more subdued or hidden. We're not talking about whether one soul's better than another soul or stronger than another soul, but it's manifestation. So it's the manifestation of it that sometimes is more transparent and sometimes more translucent.
And in the inanimate?
In inanimate, it's most hidden. but none of us knows the relative value of the essence of that particular item. As it is there, it's only one aspect of a soul that's in it, the nefesh level. The human being's made up of 5 levels of soul: nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida, so we have a greater manifestation of it.